Hello everyone, my name is Roya and I read 9 books in the latter half of February, so I'm just going to talk about each of them super quickly. The first couple of these are sequels, so I'm not going to go too into like kind of what they were about or anything like that, but the first one is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This is the third and final book in the Broken Earth trilogy, and this is definitely my favorite one in the trilogy. It makes the entire it really brings together the entire trilogy in such a brilliant way, and I loved it. Next, I read both Rogue Protocol and Exit Strategy by Martha Wells. These are the third and fourth novellas in the Murderbot Diaries series, and I really, really liked these ones the best out of the whole series. I liked all of them kind of equally so far, but these last two, I think got a lot wittier and a lot more interesting because we kind of already know the setting at this point, and a lot more of like the ongoing sort of series arc is starting to form. Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is a book about that kind of takes place in like an olden day England-esque fantasy world where a war is happening between two nations, and essentially it's gotten so bad that even women, even elderly, it doesn't matter who you are as long as you're not missing all your limbs or whatever, like anyone between 15 and 50 can be drafted, etc., etc. So it's about this girl named Emily who ends up getting drafted, and she goes and fights and all of that stuff, and the war is not as it seems to her from before she was like fighting in it and all of that other stuff. So it definitely is a very interesting account of kind of the horrors of war, as well as sort of a perspective on what men expect out of women and how women, like how hostile the world is to women. And I found a lot of that very relatable to kind of what goes on in the world today. But ultimately, I did think that we were missing a lot of the world building in this book, and I felt like it was very much just a setup for the rest of the series, because we really didn't get to see a whole lot of the world. There is like magic in this and wizards and whatnot, but we saw very little of that. Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien and edited by Christopher Tolkien. This is a full-length version of my favorite story from the Silmarillion, which is, of course, the story of Beren and Luthien. And I had an obsession with this story in college, so I was definitely very excited to read the full-length version. I'd been wanting to get to it for a while, but I just was waiting for a time where I didn't have anything to do that day, so that I could literally just sit down and read it. So this is essentially the like full-length story, but J.R.R. Tolkien hadn't like written the entire thing the whole way through, so there were parts that were kind of pieced together and like explained by Christopher Tolkien in this. So it is definitely a must for Tolkien fans. I definitely really liked it. There's a lot of really cool art in it too. Rage Becomes Her by Soraya Chemaly. This is a nonfiction feminist book about how hostile the world is to women and how just toxic masculinity, double standards, all sorts of things. And while it is kind of presented in this very info-dumpy format at times, so it's a lot of information, and so it took me like months to read this, which is kind of weird, but I did really like it. I think it's definitely a must-read for whether you already follow these issues like I do and kind of know a lot of the stuff in it, or whether you don't. Dry by Neal Shusterman and Jared Shusterman. This is a young adult book about the California drought escalating to epic proportions, and I didn't enjoy this as much as I thought that I would, partly because I think a lot of it had to do with how much post-apocalyptic stuff I've read before, like how some of my favorite books are post-apocalyptic books, and so I think that this was kind of ruined for me before I even read it, just because the entire way through I couldn't help but kind of go, that wouldn't happen that way, and that's not what would happen in that situation. But ultimately, I really am not sure how to feel about this book, because the things that I liked about this book, I really, really liked, and the things I didn't like about this book, I really didn't like. So nothing about this book was really in between. It was like either I liked a certain writing style choice or plot choice or character development or something that happened, or I like flat didn't. And also none of the characters were particularly enticing to me either. They were all just kind of like meh, and a lot of the stuff that happened felt very, very convenient, and Ultimately, I think this book was just not as much my thing as I thought it was going to be, but it's not a bad book. I do see the appeal. I see why, like, I can see a lot of people liking it, but I just didn't. So I saved the best and worst reads of the of the latter half of the month for last. So my favorite read of the month is The Women's War by Jenna Glass. This is a high fantasy about several kingdoms in which this lady kind of casts this spell where now women will only conceive a child if they want to. So if they didn't want a child with that person or in that situation or any of that, a child wouldn't be conceived no matter how many potions they take or anything to try to like get a child. So this kind of makes like a lot of the douchey guys sort of question how they're treating women, all of that. But then even when the men do kind of try to put in an effort of like, oh, I should just treat my wife better, and then maybe she'll be more willing to have a child so that she'll actually conceive a baby, blah blah blah. But then really they're still being a douchebag. That it's like they're putting in the minimal effort. So it is a very feminist book, even though it does take place in a world in which initially women have no rights. I do believe this is the first in a series because it left off in a total cliffhanger. But anyway, I really, really enjoyed this book. This is my favorite read of the year, and I have read 27 books already this year. So that's saying something. I still didn't give it 5 stars because there are some instances of fat shaming, and there are a couple of things there that are built up to be like, oh, this is going to be so bad, and it's just built up, and then it turns out to be super anticlimactic. So that happened a couple times, but for the most part, I absolutely adored this book. Everything about it was just so good. It follows so many really interesting characters that are all really different. It follows 3 different kingdoms mainly, and just all kinds of crazy stuff that happens, and I loved the crap out of this book. So I got my arc my e-arc of this via NetGalley, and it comes out on March 15th, I believe, so you guys should definitely check it out. And my least favorite book in this is Maiden by Theresa A. Harrison. This started off really good. It started off basically in olden day Ireland with like this dude and this chick who are best friends. They've been best friends since they were little kids, but the dude is getting more into religion, and not only that, he's following like priests who are kind of preaching about, oh God, like is gonna smite everyone, kind of using religion for their own gain. And the chick is pagan, and she's involved in like pagan stuff with pagan people, blah blah blah. And one day the pagan people kind of get persecuted by the priests, and that is all super interesting because then the dude who's all religious but he's best friends with the pagan chick goes, oh crap, like this is terrible, obviously these religious people actually don't know what they're talking about, blah blah blah. And he goes and saves her and all kinds of stuff, and it's really good. But then it gets, from there, it kind of just goes into a bunch of like fairy magic that's like super duper convenient and presented in such a boring way that I was just not into it. Like, even though these characters are 17, I really feel like this is a story that like 14-year-olds would enjoy more. Like, you really do have to be a lot younger to like this book. And so ultimately the rest of the book was just not what I was kind of expecting it to be from how interesting the beginning was. Like, it was so completely different. But then also there is a lot of talk that made me a little bit uncomfortable of like, oh, this horrible event that happened where, you know, the girl was saved and she lived through like all her friends dying or getting imprisoned by the priests. Well, at least something good came out of it. At least now I've seen the fairy world and I know about all this magic and blah blah blah, so it's really a good thing that it happened. And I kept thinking, well, it's not for all those people that died or all those people who are imprisoned right now. Like, they would argue that it's probably better if that never happened, okay? Like, it wasn't even mentioned just like once that, oh, it's so good that at least even though I lived through a tragedy, this happened. Like, it's not just mentioned once, it's mentioned over and over again. And I kept thinking like, dude, Are you ever gonna go maybe rescue all those other girls who are imprisoned right now by the priests and or any of that stuff? Ultimately, I didn't like this book. I gave it 2 stars, but the beginning was so awesome. I really felt like it had so much potential, but the rest of it just did not live up to that. What was so awesome about the beginning. So ultimately, I just didn't like this book. It wasn't my thing. So anyway, these are the books that I read in the second half of February. There are a lot of them. And I still didn't get to like a lot of the other books that I meant to read this month, so you will just see those in my TBR. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you think about them. I will see you very soon with a new video. Bye!